name's Anthony Schmott from Tyndall Oliver, to the website where we have all the information for this webinar and upcoming ones is in the TampaBayTrafficSafety.com. From this site, there are links over on the left under the Education tab for the Safety Academy. This is where the local area Traffic Safety Academy information is posted, registration links, upcoming webinars, which Dennis will get into. Important for this particular one is that this is the resource library where we post all of the PowerPoints of the presentations as well as the video recordings of the presentations. You'll notice that today's is already posted on there. And further down in the page, there is also a document library that has information for the previous webinars as well as PDH request form. So this is where you go to get all that information. With that, I'll hand it over to Dennis for his introduction of the Academy, and then George will do his presentation.
Good morning. My name is Dennis Falloon, and I'm the District 7 Safety Academy Coordinator and Consultant. And I'd like to welcome you to the 8th webinar for the 2015 Safety Academy Series. Today's topic is Enhancing Work Zone MOT, which is Maintenance of Traffic, Safety and Mobility. And today it will be presented by George Edmondson, who is a sergeant with the Largo Police Department, and he's also a part-time employee with Tyndall Oliver in Tampa. His background is working with road safety audits, transit studies, and work zone assessments. Now, I'd just like to kind of do a little brief introduction related to the Safety Academy. And if you've heard this before, I hate to repeat it, but it's just information I'd like to share with everybody. To understand that these webinars provide information regarding safety-related issues to enhance your local safety programs. That's the purpose of the webinars, to do that. They began in January of this past year. They usually run between 10 and 12, at least that's the allotted time. They usually go between an hour, hour and a half with Q&A, and they will end on December 16th. And the length of the webinar will depend on the complexity of the topic. And as Anthony has mentioned, there's a couple links here. That one takes you to the website, and then the other one is for registration. It tells you where to register. And then this is a list of the topics for this year. And as you can see, today is Enhancing Work Zone, MOT, Safety and Mobility. And then we have 4 more topics. And just for everybody's information, I'm working with the District 7 Safety Office, and we might be adding an additional one in September or October on a discussion about roundabouts in the Tampa area. So just look forward to that. An email will come out about that. The forms for this AICP credit are in the process of being finalized, so you'd have to go to their website and look for that. And also, I just want to bring everybody's attention to the fact you get email notices about the webinars the beginning of each month, 2 weeks before the webinar, 2 days before the webinar, and 2 hours before the actual beginning of the webinar. So you get plenty of notice about it. And as Anthony mentioned earlier, there is a PDH form for those that are professional engineers, and you would submit them to Larry at Hagen consultingservices.com, and that information is also on the form out on the website, and that's the link. So if you have any questions or anything, just let me know, and that's my information. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to George.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Now, I wanted to also let everyone know if you have any questions, I will be moderating the chat. We'll address questions either at the end or during the presentation if it's pertinent to the topic that George is talking at the moment. So just type your questions into the chat.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Good morning. Okay, I'm on. Anthony?
Yeah, we can hear you. You need
to
select the button to share your screen. You should have a prompt from GoToWebinar.
Share my screen.
Yep.
And does everybody see the first screen up there?
Not yet. Did you hit the share my screen button?
I did.
Let me try switching back and forth. I'm the presenter, show my screen. And George is the presenter. Okay, that prompt should reappear on your screen. It might be behind your PowerPoint. I don't know if you want to minimize it real quick.
This is show my screen. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. They were still okay. Now we're seeing your screen. Perfect.
Perfect.
So if you
All right. Sorry for the technical issues there this morning, folks. Well, good morning. My name is George Edmiston, and I'm with Tyndall Oliver. Thank you for the introduction there, Dennis. What we're going to talk about today is the work zone RSAs, assessments, not to be confused with just roadway safety audits, but work zone specific. And we'll work off of the final rule, which was put into place by Federal Highway back in September 2004. And basically that rule, which was finalized, basically said that all states and local governments that received federal funding had to come up and comply with some of the provisions that were set forth.
George?
Now, the rule had been in place. I'm sorry, was there a question, Anthony?
We're seeing Internet Explorer, not your PowerPoint. Do you have PowerPoint up on your screen?
I do. Saying it's paused now. Can you see it now?
No. Here, let's go with Plan B. I'll make myself the presenter and show the screen, and just let me know when you want me to switch slides. Is everyone able to see the screen? The presentation?
I've got it on my end here. Anthony, you should be on the second slide there where it says work zone, final roll.
Okay.
Okay. And that rule would focus on state level work policies. It would reflect the changing times to address more traffic. Obviously today we have more traffic congestion, greater safety issues, and more work zones. Our roadways, as you know, are aging, and some of the other issues of addressing safety and mobility in itself are the keys to the new rule that was implemented back then. And the question we ask is, why was it updated? Well, obviously vehicle travel is up. Today, growth is up as well, and little growth in the roadway miles over the past year. So as we know, there's a lot of work zones currently taking place today versus 10 years ago when this rule was implemented. Our highways have reached that middle age, so to speak, and there are more work zones. A growing portion of this work is rehabilitation, and then more traffic is exposed to those work zones, making the workers themselves exposed. So the safety would come in through the workers themselves who work in the construction zones, as well as those that are exposed to it as drivers, daily commuters, the customers we call. And when this was implemented, there were over 41,000 injuries and crashes and a little over 1,000 traffic fatalities. So the travelers today were not happy with the congestions, the road conditions, the delays, and inconsistencies. So to bring work zone safety up to speed, the final rule allowed for adjusted changes and uniforming it and making each state that received the federal funding accountable for implementing these changes. Next slide, please. Thank you. One other thing I wanted to mention before is some of the questions that we should take away from this are the work zones performing with respect to mobility and safety? Are the best decisions being made in planning and designing? Are the work zones related? The complaints and incidents and crashes being identified, documented, and addressed? And are customers' expectations being met in respect to maintaining safety and mobility? The needs for work zone safety obviously revolve around the motorist, the bicyclist, pedestrians, all the multimodal users, including transit with public transit, trucks, and obviously pedestrians, as I mentioned before, within the highways or on the private roads which were open to travel. Now we'll talk about the 4 E's of the education, the enforcement, engineering, and EMS. My role in most of the work zone safety was to bring the law enforcement side of it to the approach of the assessment. On most of the assessments that we'd performed throughout District 7, and we did 1 in each county, I would bring the local law enforcement agency who had jurisdiction in that particular work zone to the table, including EMS, fire, to get their feedback in those pre-meetings to discuss concerns that they may have that design folks may not be aware of in implementing the traffic control devices and traffic control plans as well as the MOT. What you want to do is look at it from the roadway user's perspective. In other words, would you feel comfortable allowing your family to travel through that safety, that work zone safely? You want to provide a clear and defined path. And does that work zone provide that positive guidance that we're looking for? And to reduce the number of decisions. Fewer decisions obviously lead to fewer crashes and conflicts. Next slide, please. The information obviously is provided to all roadway users, standardized throughout the work zones that meets their expectations. We want to ensure that critical information is spread out throughout the approach of the work zone so that all roadway users aren't loaded with information at one given time. This is the perfect example of the use of variable message boards, detour signs, business signs, and things of that nature, going one step further to keep the information clear as they traverse those work zones. And has information needs been met to allow them to navigate safely through that work zone? And ask the question, are all hazards in the work zones identified so that they're visible and therefore avoidable to all roadway users? Like I said, the variable message boards, when they're used properly, reduce speed ahead, curve ahead, the use of arrow boards, all those additional devices that should be spelled out in the traffic control plan are key essentials to giving that positive guidance as they travel through work zones. Next slide, please. The nominal versus substantial safety. If you could just click one time, Anthony, as we go through this. Nominal safety is the first step, and it's basically meeting the minimum standards. Again, Anthony, there you go. The use of advanced warning signs as they approach a curve. Again, Anthony. And then advisory speeds. This would be considered just nominal placement or signing of a curved roadway. The second step to go one step further, substantial side of safety, would be to include, one more time, Anthony just cruise through there, the advanced sign, warning signs, adding the advisory speed signs, And the next step, just to make the best or the safest route, would be to include chevrons. As you can see, this roadway in itself includes a bicycle lane. There's lack of street lighting, the curve ahead. So you want to give as much safety or warning to those drivers ahead as they approach. And this would include most of those as they go through work zones. The use of chevrons and retroreflective materials to allow the advanced and make it a safer intersection or roadway to travel through. Next slide, Anthony. We're going to talk about some of the enhancement opportunities, and we'll talk about some of these in greater length in slides as we move forward. But the 4 E's in the entire process, like I said, include the law enforcement, engineering, EMS, and education. These 4 folks, including, when I say engineering, we really need to start bringing design folks on board for the designing of the MOT and the traffic control plans, and put emphasis on everybody coming to the table in pre-construction meetings and discussing some concerns that they may have as this plan or this work zone moves forward. What better resource to obtain some of that information than from the feet on the ground, so to speak, from law enforcement, who have probably countless hours of working crashes or issues along that roadway or intersections, and including EMS. Not to forget about, they have certain protocols that they have to meet in regards to their iOS ratings and response times for EMS calls. So when we design work zones and build the plans of the MOT, we also need to keep in consideration how they're going to respond to emergency situations. How do they traverse standing traffic or intersections or construction zones that have low profile barriers or delineators that are not mountable, so to speak. So it's really important to bring all those folks together, including the transit folks, to address some of those concerns before the plans are actually put together in the design phase. And all 4 E's need to be included through the entire process with the contractor and with the state in progress meetings, either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly throughout the entire process. This way they can address some of the issues that they discover along the way. And we'll talk about those as we get further into the presentation here. Speed management. Obviously, the reduction in speed zoning, it should be avoided as much as practical in work zones, only because drivers will slow as they typically feel they need to do so. You want to ask yourself that question: are the speed limits equal or less than the design speed in that particular work zone? Is there adequate signing? Is the speed limit posted in a work zone, or what's going to be posted through the plans, adequate for that roadway? Do you feel safe traveling that adequate speed? Is it, if it was 55 prior and the work zone establishes it at 55, can you navigate through that work zone safely at 55? And that's where the reduction in speed may be required, but typically on interstate roadways, there's not always a reduction in that. You continue, but you also need to include enforcement's enrollment in assisting with ensuring that speed compliance is out there during the work zones. And this is also discussed in those pre-construction meetings for the contractors to allow for enforcement pads or areas or times when they need assistance, when they're workers for night work, to allow for speed enforcement on a sporadic occasion and continue through that, whether it's a paid item on the traffic control plan or it's simply them coming out to handle enforcement throughout their daily routine process there. And then under those speed, if the speed limit is not being enforced, then obviously it creates safety issues to workers as well as other drivers who are trying to guide their way through the work zones. Positive guidance pretty much speaks for itself. Positive guidance is the easiest way to explain it. It's the easiest way to navigate through a work zone where there's plenty of signage, adequate lane markings and roadway markings, as well as advanced signing for businesses or upcoming roadways. And we'll show you some of those examples as we move forward. Traffic control devices, those in themselves, including repositioning of temporary traffic control devices. Pedestrian signals need to be considered during work zones, stop signs, and if the original stop signs aren't being used, they should be covered and new ones meeting the standards, including taking it one step further to include bright sticks if that's necessary to give that positive guidance or the attention that a new stop sign exists. This includes speed signs and video microwave detections. Obviously, we know that the first process in work zones is milling of the roadways, which typically destroys most of the loop detection. So temporary detection needs to be included in some of that repositioning of temporary traffic control devices, so to keep that in mind. The signals and timing, typically in a work zone, you should look at the timing reports on signals that are within that work zone. Consider looking at the ITS if it's hooked through that system. And for the turning maneuvers, if there is no loop detection in place, what is the best for that? If the intersection traffic signals are going down and video detection was used, do you switch over to microwave for temporary and mount that pole side, or make sure that there is some sort of temporary detection in place and not just go to a recall position for those signals as it causes backups, which is seen in the past. The markings, pavement markings, removal of new and old, obviously they need to be removed to the extent that it doesn't cause confusion to drivers. For example, turn arrows and road identifiers. There is no perfect way to actually, what we've discovered in most of these roadway assessments and work zones is between water blasting and grinding. There's no perfect solution to removal of painted markings on the roadways. Some contractors do better than others, but obviously there's no perfect one. Things to consider with that are pavement overlays if the markings can't be removed, where they can be repositioned in another area not to cause confusion to drivers. And the pavement, another big thing to look for, you know, the condition. Is there a lot of potholes or are there patches? And does the asphalt contrast with concrete surfaces out there? Because we need to look at this work zone assessment from a daytime and nighttime approach. Contrasting pavement through rainwater or lack of lighting or little lighting can cause a lot of confusion to motorists, which obviously leads to some of those higher crashes within work zones. And obviously the biggest goal is to reduce those numbers of crashes, injuries, and deaths. Obviously something else to consider in the pavement and the milling process to ensure that the MOT plans are followed, that any milling that's done out there, you consider the multimodal user for uneven lanes and tapering of milling asphalt, where milled surfaces should be limited to how long or if drivers can actually operate on those surfaces within that work zone, but to also keep into consideration some of those uneven roadways where there are times that they will traverse milled surfaces, that we keep those tapers down to a minimum. Next slide, please. Lane assignments. Obviously, lane assignments are important at intersections. The alignment on the opposite side of the intersection is extremely important, which would cause the side swipe collisions, and so we want to avoid any of those. So lane assignments need to be clear with positive guidance through either temporary lane markings or variable message boards of lane shifts ahead or something to that nature, to ensure that the drivers have advance warning of some of those lane assignments. Barrel alignment can also be used for that, but there's several different applications that can be used to allow for the lane alignments and keep that positive guidance through intersections. Exits and entrances, obviously they need to be properly marked and signed. Advanced signing always works. I always like to use the interstates for like rest areas, 1 mile ahead, 1/2 mile ahead, those overhead cantilevers where they actually give motorists that advance time to know where their exits or driveways are. This is just another example that can be used in work zones and do the same thing. And you'll see some examples of those in some further slides where they'll announce certain roadways, left turn ahead, 1/2 mile ahead. So give the advance warning so people can change lanes, or the motorists themselves, who we call as our customers, can safely traverse and make those turns or changes at exits and driveway entrances. Transitions obviously need to be signed. The use of arrow boards, RPMs can be used. Lighting is extremely important. Most of the work zone assessments that we have done, we would do a daytime and a nighttime assessment because work zones look differently during different times of the day, and obviously lighting is a huge part of the nighttime assessment. And some questions to walk and ask yourself during those assessments would be, was the lighting adequate? And is it being maintained by the contractor? Sometimes we know that the contractor, when they take responsibility for a roadway, they're responsible for the entire existing traffic control devices, lighting, and we don't want to see lighting load segments taken out of service because they're being replaced. And if they are replaced, are we actually making sure that they're put back in service prior to the completion of the entire work zone? Also consider the use of temporary lighting, that when it's being used for roadway construction, that it's not glaring to oncoming traffic and causes a distraction to drivers. Transit, like I said, they should be included as well as in the 4 E's for the pre-construction portions of meetings, because their assessment on their bus stops are typically needing required bus stop terminals, temporary sidewalks, shelters, and you may want to include in the design plans temporary pullouts for them. Pedestrian accommodations, obviously this is something that really needs to be considered in the MOT. Keeping them in the MOT plans ensures accessibility, areas for them to walk, and obviously pedestrian safety as they traverse through work zones becomes part of the fatality statistic and injuries, because they're not easily seen through construction barrels or type 3 barricades. And to ensure that crosswalks and some of those markings are put in place where they have safe places to traverse, where we also discussed having some of those temporary signals moved and put into place for safe crossings of pedestrians or bicyclists within that work zone. Wrong way movements. What we've seen in a lot of wrong way movement things are the conflicting signs or pavement markings. When an old roadway goes in through its transition of a work zone, if certain roadway pavement markings aren't properly removed, they could align with on-ramps or off-ramps and cause distractions, which would give to the wrong way movements. So some of the things that should be considered in those are the use of barriers and delineators, variable message boards. We'll take it one step further, but also you need to ensure that the pavement markings are not conflicting or signs are not conflicting to avoid some of those wrong way movements. The maintenance on existing roadways belongs to that contractor. So as part of those daily inspections, lighting needs to be inspected. Vegetation on the side of the roadway needs to be kept to a minimum. Traffic control devices need to be maintained, as well as any red light camera systems that may be in place. I remember one specific assessment we did where a traffic control device was solar powered. It was a flashing red beacon on a stop sign, And because during the construction, the contractor became responsible for that particular stop sign, so instead of replacing it with a new stop sign or a bright stick for an enhancement, they just used a variable message board to say stop ahead, because the flashing beacon wasn't working all the time. The maintenance of the batteries wasn't maintained. So sometimes it's just looking for some of those obvious quick fixes of removing an antiquated stop sign and replacing it with a modern stop sign, and including bright sticks or stop sign ahead, advanced plaque warnings. Something that's simple and gives the roadway user the knowledge that a stop sign's in place ahead, and not so much trying to chase your tail and keep the existing lighting that's not working adequately at that intersection in place. So that's just an example of it. The project staging, very important where construction equipment is staged in work zones. Obviously, we don't want construction equipment and materials to cause visual obstructions to travelers, including driveway accesses or street signage or markings in the roadway. So staging should also be considered as part of that MOT or your traffic control plan, to include that there's certain areas where equipment and materials are stored not to interfere with traffic. And then the opening of completed sections. Although this remains as part of the contractor's ultimate decision, and typically a lot of those open sections don't open until completion of a project, consider looking at some of those sections to be opened as they're completed, as sidewalks are completed and reopened. Open those back up to pedestrian access, as well as any driveway accesses or things of that nature. Street lighting is also important, even if it's a replacement or new systems. As soon as they're in place, try to encourage the contractors to get those operational to assist in that work zone navigation. Next slide, please. Anthony, can I get the next slide? Thank you. All right, the coordination with law enforcement in developing the MOT. I discussed earlier how it's important to bring them into pre-construction meetings, including design. The ongoing informal communications with law enforcement to determine who has jurisdiction within those work zones, and work with those folks directly. Find out what concerns they have in this work zones, what hazards could be perceived, which could include special events that are scheduled throughout the year, and a construction project may be longer. Take into consideration some of those traffic issues that may come as a result, that they only can provide that information. And without their feedback, some of this information can't be brought forward. And some of the contracted things in the traffic control plan to include law enforcement could be used during lane closures, the changing of traffic signals, or selective enforcement. If there's no money budgeted in that project for selective enforcement, I can assure you that simply a phone call to that local agency explaining you need some help with speed enforcement in a work zone, if you speak to the proper folks who are in charge of traffic enforcement in those agencies, they can schedule those during those peak hours that are needed, and all you need to do is simply tell them the best location where they can use, and you can coordinate those efforts. Just the mere presence of having officers out there can reduce that speed and make it safer for their workers as well as the motoring public. Next slide. This is a photo we took of actually an emergency vehicle trying to reverse a work zone. Obviously, they used in the plans here delineators that were mountable, but in this particular photograph, you can see this fire engine traversed well over a half mile in oncoming traffic because of backed up lanes there, and some of that traffic was backed up because of some lack of temporary detection for that turn lane, as well as who was queuing the correct traffic patterns during peak times there. So to bring fire into the pre-construction aspects, they can tell you what they need, how often they actually will be driving through those work zones for emergency calls. Is that their destination route for a particular assisted living facility where they handle 5 or 6 medical calls a day? So this is some information they can provide. Obviously, at times traversing the opposite lanes of traffic to get to an emergency is necessary, but are there things we can put in the plans in place to allow for safer EMS response to keep with their response times and what their requirements are for responses? Next screen, please. Work zone crashes. Let's talk about those, and obviously it's the reason why work zone safety came about. But what we need to analyze in the assessment side of it is, are the crashes in the project being reported? And if they are, who are they being reported to? Is it to the project manager or just the contractor? And is everybody in clear communication to those? And how are those crash reports being received? Is law enforcement contacting the contractor or the project manager to say, hey, we had a crash last night and this is it? Including enforcement in that pre-construction meeting where you establish some of those communications, and this is your contact person for law enforcement for the work zone, can be simply handled, did we have any crashes last week? And that particular person could provide that information to you. And then is the project personnel in direct contact with that law enforcement on a weekly basis? Are photographs being documenting work zone crashes? And is the documentation of job site accidents, including workers, available, as well as police reports to the project managers throughout the process? Do project operations create unexpected queuing, stoppage, and slowing down? So when we have unexpected stopping, obviously rear end collisions are going to be on the increase. Queuing or slowing or lack of turn lanes could cause additional sideswipe collisions. So we're not talking always about serious injury or fatal crashes, but just minor collisions. But is the work zone actually affecting the collision rate or bringing those up? And what changes can be made in that work zone to eliminate some of those concerns or issues? And obviously a written policy would be required for the best systematic approach on how you would handle crashes, who's responsible through the project manager or the contractor for the job site. Next, please. Some proactive enforcement enhancements for work zones. There's a couple examples, and I mentioned them earlier. The use of a variable message board where it clearly shows that the next signal is Egret Drive. This way, the traffic that enters onto the roadway can get over 2 lanes safely to make their left turn in advance, knowing that advanced signage is available through the use of a variable message board. Speed feedback signs obviously have their use if they're built into the plans. And obviously speed is something that needs to always be considered in some of those work zones. It's basically an awareness tool. Obviously it needs to be coupled with enforcement and communication with law enforcement for any additional needs or supports in speed enforcement out there. The location and the placements of these devices are key. A variable message board less than a block away from that traffic signal is not going to be effective, as in this photograph where it depicts it several blocks away, to give those motorists the opportunity to make any lane changes necessary to approach that intersection. And obviously less confusion will lead to fewer crashes. Next slide, please. Some other enhancements is, as you can see here, the use of additional RPMs, Although some traffic control plans don't call for the use to this extent, this is just an illustration of how some contractors go one step beyond. This roadway to the left in the illustration shows that there's a lack of street lighting, but the retroreflective material that's used there between the barricades, the barrels, the lights on all the barrels which work, coupled with high reflective paint and the use of multiple RPMs gives that positive guidance through the work zone, which causes less confusion, and it's easier and safer to travel on. The illustration to the right just shows that there's some opportunities here for enhancements of last turn before a bridge sign that was put in place. The use of barrels as delineators or lane markings to show that this is a clear defined turn lane with the use of roadway markings with the arrows as well. So to provide some of those extra things, it's obvious it's a turn lane, but the use of additional arrows and the barrels and signage just gives it the extra enhancement needed to guide those users through the roadway. Next slide, please. Nighttime positive guidance. Obviously, I discussed earlier, we talked about daytime versus nighttime assessments. A roadway looks totally different during the daytime, and traveling upon it sometimes at nighttime can be difficult because of a lack of street lighting or lack of inadequate number of reflective devices. Are those devices meeting the standards in reflectability? Although the requirements for lighted barrels, the lights on barrels will be going away in the future, the new protocol will be the reflectability of those barrels. So as you travel through those work zones, are those barrels meeting the reflectability requirements that are set forth by the standard, and replacing some of those barrels as needed. That's why it's key for those morning and evening inspections of those work zones to ensure that all barrels are in place and properly aligned and meeting the reflectability requirements. The use, like I said, of RPMs, this is a perfect example of giving positive guidance versus skip use of RPMs. It just guides the user through the roadway. Next. Channelizing devices. There's several that are used throughout work zones, and we've seen cones are very seldomly used. However, the tubular markers, barrels, and type 1, 2, and 3 barricades, low-profile barriers are an excellent tool where the posted speed limits are below 45 miles per hour. But you also have to ensure that these low-profile barriers are connected and anchored to the roadway. The low-profile barrier provides a lot of safety to the workers within the work zone, keeping the traffic separated from work zone areas of where construction is taking place. So the use of those devices are definitely handy or instrumental, but obviously they need to meet the speed specifications or requirements of less than 45 miles per hour. Delineation devices with tubular markers give for positive guidance, and the use of the barrels as type 1 and type 3 barricades for road closed signs are definitely needed and required and provide positive guidance as well. Next. Temporary traffic control or pavement markings. Obviously, this is just depicting another show of the proper use of barrels and alignment within a work zone, the tapering as lane shifts, reflectability, and it's clear and precise where the guided path of traffic is. Those temporary traffic control devices or the barrels or the use of type 3 barricades just assist the motorist in the clear defined path of traveling through the work zones. Next slide. Temporary pavement markings. You can see in this photograph the use of thermoplastic lane markings and additional RPMs installed. Pavement markings depicting left turns and right turns. The use of thermoplastics needs to be approved, obviously, in the MOT plans, but it certainly has applications that are good in roadways that are going to be redesigned the next night of a construction project. They're easily removed versus the milling or grinding, which can cause obviously confusion to other drivers, how they're milled or water blasted, and they also avoid the ruts that are placed into a high friction course or open grade friction. So this is just another temporary pavement marking that can be used as a thermoplastic to give clear guidance to the travel lanes within this work zone. Next. Pavement marking removal. I discussed milling or grinding is the most common. Water blasting as well. As you can see, the photograph to the right depicts an overlay. But you can see in the photograph to the left that there was some either water blasting or grinding in place, which still gives positive guidance to the proper lane travels in this. However, when there's multiple aspects of water blasting or grinding, it can cause some confusion to drivers, including nighttime travels or when the roadway is wet. So obviously the best course to do is when there is the use of grinding or milling in place and new lane markings are in place, the use of RPMs should be encouraged, as well as retroreflective paint for those lane markings. But like I said, there is no perfect way to remove lines in a construction zone on worn pavement. And you also have to use caution when you're using milling, grinding, or water blasting in friction course 5 or an open grade friction, because obviously that causes the roadway to erupt and lose asphalt and causes water pooling and things of that nature. So an overlay of pavement may be required to get the proper alignment in lanes and cause less confusion. Obviously there's additional cost to that, but keep safety in mind and consider that if the milling or grinding causes some confusion to clear lane division of travel. Next. The traffic signals, obviously you can see here this is a timing report for a particular intersection. The traffic signal reports should be checked on a weekly basis, working with either whoever has jurisdiction with those traffic signals, whether it be the county or the state or a local entity, and then retime those changes to the intersection based on some of the peak times if necessary. If traffic's moving and flowing correctly, then obviously all you need to do is just continue to monitor those on a weekly basis. But also keep in mind the use of detection devices. If a video is in use and it's still working as a result of not being milled up during the process of construction, obviously video is one of the best ways to do it. Microwave is still used. We've seen that in some work zones, but the best would obviously to be used microwave. Would not. Loop and video would be the best detection devices to use throughout those work zones for accurate traffic timing signals. Next slide, please. Pedestrian accommodations. A lot of times pedestrian accommodations are overlooked in MOTs that we've seen. And the best way to determine what's happening with pedestrians is to actually go out there and walk the construction zones to see what pedestrians are doing, where they're walking, where they're traversing intersections or roadways, where the high volume or use of pedestrians is at. With new construction, obviously the question to ask is, when is the best time to open new sidewalks and pedestrian crossings? That usually relies on the contractor, but we encourage the open use of those new sidewalks as soon as they're constructed and contiguous, that those sidewalks be reopened and put into full use for pedestrian accommodations. To include some of the existing sidewalks and crosswalks, if they're taken out of service, are they properly marked with sidewalks closed ahead, and are there alternative crossings or sidewalks in place? And temporary asphalt or concrete or whatever is used for their temporary in their plans must be in place, and you need to ensure that those things are in place for the pedestrian accommodations. Next slide. This is just an illustration of the diagram of the intersection for pedestrian accommodations on new design of a work zone where laddered crosswalks go through an intersection, as well as creating the shortest distance, pork chop islands as a refuge. So consider the shortest distance and the clearest defined paths for pedestrians in the projects during the design phase, which is included in this illustration. But the easily accessibility to those crosswalks, would it be best served to have a four-legged crosswalk at this intersection versus three? And that all can be determined based on what type of pedestrian activity is taking place on this roadway. To ensure that when the construction is taking place, the temporary pedestrian accommodations, including removing and replacing countdown signals, are in place, or temporary thermoplastic crosswalks are in place for those pedestrians to traverse those roadways. And a lot of that can do with transit stops if they're near side or far side to intersections, could lead to higher crossings at those intersections. So keep those into consideration during the design phase, as well as throughout the construction, and providing temporary crossings for those pedestrians. The question is who pays for that if it's not built into it, and are the contractors willing to take one extra step further to ensure pedestrian safety during the work zone? Next slide, please. These are some examples of some temporary sidewalks that were in place that went one step further by the contractor, using crushed asphalt and half-inch steel plate to extend the sidewalks to the existing crosswalks at an intersection. The photograph at the left shows a lack of temporary sidewalks or passages. The new sidewalks in this particular project were completed, however, they weren't opened, and pedestrians typically were crossing at all other places besides the intersection in this photograph. But we really need to give a little more emphasis to pedestrian safety within work zones, because from experience I can tell you most deaths in work zones that I've worked in my career related to pedestrians that were concealed behind construction barrels or crossing at locations that weren't the safest, and because there were no pedestrian accommodations or openings in roadways, they took inherent chances and crossed, and as a result were either injured or killed in some of those work zones. So pedestrian emphasis really needs to be added, including enforcement. That can be handled through those pre-construction meetings with enforcement, where if the contractor or the project manager explains we're having issues with pedestrians, that simple communication can be communicated to law enforcement, and they can use various aspects of high visibility enforcement funds to conduct enforcement in those areas, or education through Cutter, things of that nature. So use all the resources available, but proper communication to the folks in enforcement would lead to those that assistance, I should say. Next slide, please. Transit. I mean, obviously, transit's been in place on most roadways prior to any work zones, and buses can't efficiently detour their routes just because of a work zone. Short-term maintenance projects or road closed, we need to keep in consideration transit. How are folks getting to the transit stops? Are the users provided information or educational material to tell them where the bus stops are being relocated? Are they ADA compliant? And then those traffic control plans should provide some of those features, such as accessibility to those bus stops, maybe temporary pullouts, waiting areas, bus terminals for some of those patrons, including persons with disabilities. So transit included in the beginning of those pre-construction meetings and the design would assist, only to say that if there's, don't miss an opportunity to relocate a transit stop in a work zone in that pre-construction phase. If that transit stop has a high ridership and there's a lot of pedestrian issues going along with that transit stop, meaning mid-block crossings for one bus stop to another. So there would be an opportunity to take a transit stop before a traffic control plan is completed or the MOT is completed and the design to relocate some of those bus stops to include shelters or anything else. But that needs to be done in the design phase to make that successful. Otherwise, if it remains in the same position, obviously we need to keep in consideration some temporary sidewalks or staging areas for those transit riders. Next slide. The overhead guide signs obviously are an excellent tool, provide positive guidance if there's proper alignment. These should be monitored throughout the work zone as lanes shift or traffic shifts from one side of the roadway to the other. And obviously they need to be covered if they're not in use. But the alignment is key. As you can see the illustration to the right, the signs are not aligned properly during this phase of the work zone. So obviously either covered or relocated would be the proper response. It causes too much confusion. The ones to the left actually do show proper alignment and give the proper message of what your final destination is. And an excellent use of additional overhead guide signs along with pavement markings would include some of the projects like on 275, where the 275 and the I-4 signals are pavement markings along that roadway, which gives obviously positive guidance to those roadway users. So it's something to consider in those final plans as well and in the design phase. Next slide. Business signing, extremely important in congested work zone areas. It clearly defines the driveway entrances and exits, as well as provides a lot of positive feedback from the businesses feeling they're part of the project and they're not losing business as a result. The sign cost usually comes as an expense to the contractor, or if it's not built into the plans. But these are excellent guide signs that give that advance warning to motorists that this is the driveway for McDonald's or this is the driveway for Taco Bell. So another excellent tool that's being seen and used throughout a lot of work zones in the District 7 area. Next slide. This is an illustration of a perfect example of where business signing could be used on a work zone. This is a 4-lane divided roadway, speed limit 55, and there's businesses located throughout this entire work zone. However, the driveways set off to the side aren't clearly defined as to what businesses those ingress or egress you'll see a little Volkswagen parked on the side of the roadway. It actually looks like it's exiting, but it's just parked for sale out there. So, monitoring these work zones as to what's in place, the placement of trash cans in driveway accesses to businesses, these things need to be monitored by the contractor during those morning and evening inspections of those work zones. So just another example of where business signing would probably be most appropriate and better serve some of the customers on this work zone. And next slide. I'll open it up to questions at this point. I know I covered a lot of material, and there are packets available that the Federal Highway Administration developed prompt list for work zone safety assessments. So it's basically a prepackaged program that you can go in and do an assessment, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Now, we have taken the District 7 one and customized it a little bit more to some of more appropriate areas of like business signing and things of that nature, where in rural areas it wouldn't be necessary, but they can be modified or adjusted to whatever your community needs are for that prompt list. The work zones themselves, when we have the assessment, most of the meetings we have, a lot of project managers and contractors here, they believe it's an audit where they're, some folks are coming in to check on them, and it's not an audit. It's basically an assessment to determine how your work zones are set up. Are they working? Are things being documented properly? Are crashes being documented? Are things being done to reduce the numbers of crashes? Are you making changes in the traffic control plan to accommodate some of those changes, or timing or signals or things of that nature, receiving some of those enhancements that would best serve the motoring public? So we've also taken some of those meetings and saw what some contractors and project managers have done in their projects and shared some of those thoughts with other project managers throughout the district to say, this is what they're doing here, it's working, and you might want to consider that. So it's really an excellent tool. It's an open communication meeting where we learn from them, they learn from us, and it's all about safety and mobility and providing the safest route through our work zones. Obviously, we're going to see more of those as our roadways continue to age and the area continues to grow. Our roadways are growing with them. So work zone safety is not going away. So at this point, I'd open it up to any questions.
We have one question in the chat, George. You should be able to pull the chat over on your end if you'd like to read them as well. But the question is, most resurfacing projects are TCP level 1. There may not be the means to provide this level of necessary detail to the TCP for a resurfacing project. Any suggestions?
Well, I would also consider whoever's in charge of that project or providing permits for that project, take an opportunity to look at what the MOT for that temporary construction project would be. And we see a lot of those in county-wide projects or on the local level. Or, there's so many tools out there available through the use of variable message boards and barrels and cones and barricades, and a lot of those temporary zones are lacking the use of those devices. So take it one step further during issuing the permits and look at them and ensure that the most positive guidance can be added to those temporary projects, even on a simple milling and resurfacing project. Encourage the use of law enforcement if necessary, if it's nighttime work and it's an unlit roadway that's highly traveled, things of that nature. Although it's not required, it's taking one step further to ensure that safety.
There was a comment about, I believe it was this slide, in the business signing. Yeah, there's an example of an issue that resulted in a lawsuit several years ago. The barrels blocked the view of smaller vehicles entering through the MOT devices. Next slide.
Yes. And I've seen that, and I discussed that earlier, where the use of barrels in a work zone are very good at delineating traffic and guiding folks through a construction project. However, I've seen where barrels have blocked the view of pedestrians, and it's easy to conceal a pedestrian behind a barrel, especially on a dark, unlit roadway. And when a pedestrian takes inherent risk of running out in front of a car, the ability to see that person prior to them stepping in front of your car is difficult. So, yes, the barrels do conceal. That's why in some projects where low-profile barriers can be used as a delineation tool with reflectors, it's an excellent tool as long as it's properly mounted. And, it provides an excellent safety feature to the workers in those work zones because it protects them as well. It keeps the cars out of the work zones versus, a barrel, which is lightweight, that can be easily run over and allow a vehicle into a work zone, which could hazard some of those, hurt some of those workers. So, what is the best use? That's part of that whole pre-construction meeting of law enforcement, EMS coming in and saying, look, and we have high volumes of traffic. This is what traffic does. This is the pattern. We need to keep traffic on the roadway and keep it channelized. And would the best use for that project be a low-profile barrier? Does it meet those speed requirements? And if it does, consider that use. Obviously, there's more cost to it. It's more difficult to move as lane shifts occur, but it's safety in mind. So I would encourage the use of that and fewer barrels when you're dealing with driveway accesses or high pedestrian crossing roadways.
There was an interesting conversation, George, that you and I had with some of the construction project managers when we were doing these assessments for the district regarding the law enforcement support. Can you speak a little bit to? I think it was an issue with speeding through the work zones and the relationship between law enforcement and those construction project managers and how they can get help from law enforcement if they need.
Right. Excellent question. The lack of communication all starts with sometimes folks just not knowing who to call. And that's really one of the things that's key to my job is I'm a liaison to all the law enforcement agencies within this district. And it's my job basically to put project managers, if they so desire, to speak to somebody who has jurisdiction in those projects, to put them in communication with the right person. That communication, once it's set early in the development stages or the design stages, having the right person there can bring all the right players to the table as well. If it's a speeding issue or a red light running issue, those folks can deploy all the resources that are necessary, whether it's motorcycles or unmarked traffic vehicles for speed enforcement. And sometimes all they ask for is, if we come out there and work, can you provide a safe area in your work zone for us to work? Can you set a staging area or an enforcement pad area? And that's just a matter of teamwork, working with law enforcement, the project managers, and the contractors to, come up with one common goal and keep things safe, but providing whatever means is necessary to do it safely. If law enforcement's not aware that you have a speeding issue in your construction zone or your work zone, then they may not address it. If you establish that communication early in those pre-construction meetings, make them part of the program or the solution, and take their feedback, then that communication just goes a long way throughout the whole project, because it's simply as picking up the phone and calling Sergeant Smith and saying, hey, we've got an issue with a red light running at this intersection, or the cars are speeding during the work zone, or we're doing a pavement overlay tonight and we need some assistance. That can be handled just with one quick phone call, of knowing who to call and having the right resources at hand to deploy those assets to your work zone.
That highlights the importance of that pre-meeting. Also, you mentioned earlier in the presentation getting fire, emergency response involved. Let them know that anything changes.
And this involves not just work zone projects, but all projects, including police and fire. What better way than to communicate with the folks who travel that roadway all the time and know some of the issues? And there may be a construction project in place or in the development stages, and you want to know, will this plan work for law enforcement? Will it work for fire? And are there going to be any concerns? And if those things can be brought to the attention before the design phase starts, some of those accommodations can be considered, or you may have to just reconsider a total different plan. And we've seen this in different work zone projects as well as, like barrier wall projects.
Training opportunities, George, that there's different ways that people can learn more about MOT.
Absolutely, yes. The Federal Highway Administration will provide all that information, has work zone training opportunities and online courses to take to provide the information that's necessary to complete work zone safety assessments. And obviously, teaming up with somebody, I've worked with Anthony and Rudy from Federal Highway, and folks who actually built these programs together have provided me a lot of knowledge and information and background on some of these work zones. But the information that was created, and it's all available online, and we'll provide that with this closing on the webinar as part of the prompt list as well.
I don't have any other questions in the chat presently. Peter Shoes chiming in. Says District 7 Safety Office is working on their magic to bring free work zone training to Tampa Bay, face-to-face training. Peter, I can unmute you if you'd like, if you just want to have some closing remarks. Peter.
There's 3 of them. You'll have to unmute. I don't know which one he's on.
Peter logged in multiple places. Peter, are you there? No, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I believe I unmuted him, but he may be.
Peter?
No, it says no mute. I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's all right. I mean, if anybody else has any other questions, we can hang out online for a few minutes. I don't see anything else in the chat. Thank you, George. This was definitely a good overview of the work zone safety, and the relationship between law enforcement and those projects is really valuable. And having a law enforcement personnel do the presentation is really neat that we have their expertise with us.
Well, I appreciate that, and that can be, like I said, included in all different projects, including safety audits and transit studies. Find out, what the feet on the ground can tell you, because as engineers, sometimes you don't have, the designing phase, you don't have that knowledge of the day-to-day operations of that particular roadway segment, and the feet on the ground are the ones that actually can provide that information to you. And maybe things that you already know, but you may pick up something and say, hey, we never thought of that, and we should really consider that in the design phase or the traffic control plan, because simple things is a large event, a state fair, or things of that nature that may visit your work zone once, every year. You need to have some of those, considerations in mind of, have you thought about this event, which is going to bring an additional 40,000 vehicles to your work zone in November? And having that information just can really change the way you put your plans together.
George, this is Dennis.
Yeah.
I want to thank you again for your presentation, and I want to thank all those that attended today. And I'm glad you put up with our little technical glitch in the beginning, but I think everything went great. And if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them now, or if not, we will probably end the recording.